Have you ever looked up at the night sky and wondered how the vast expanse of the universe, with its countless stars and galaxies, came into existence? How do you explain the incredible diversity of plants and animals that fill our habitable planet? How old is the Earth? And how can we know for sure? And how do you explain the origin of mankind and the beautifully diverse ethnic groups? Put simply, where did everything come from?
For centuries, we have struggled to understand where we came from. Many theories have been proposed, some rational and thought-provoking, others wildly speculative and seemingly impossible to verify. So how do we sort through all of these theories to determine which one is most logical? Modern science is revealing important clues to this puzzle, helping us to better understand the full picture of our origin. However, the mystery still remains. Where did everything come from?
The standard answer offered is the Big Bang explanation for the origin of the universe and the evolutionary theory for the origin of the species. This means whether it was the formation of the universe, the first life forms, or people, the answer is the same. It was all the result of blind natural processes acting on matter and energy over many millions and even billions of years. As stated by National Geographic magazine, it all began in chaos. In other words, the universe and everything in it, including you and me, are nothing more than the sum total of a series of natural accidents. For the Big Bang theory, the universe formed through accidental collisions of atomic particles. For biological evolution, the species formed through accidental copying errors in the DNA called mutations. This is the story we've all been told. But what if the standard answer is not as convincing as we may have been led to believe? What if there are fundamental problems with the Big Bang and the evolutionary theory that scientists are well aware of, but have not been made known to the general public? In the last decade alone, compelling new evidences from the major fields of science have cast serious doubt on the evolutionary view of natural history. Discoveries so profound, if made known to the world, would have the power to drastically change our understanding of the past. Might the biblical view of origins as described in the book of Genesis offer a more reasonable explanation? To some, it is extremely naive to even consider the Genesis account of creation on the grounds that it is believed to be nothing more than a primitive myth, and therefore totally incompatible with modern science. This stems from the widely held perception that creation is religion and evolution is science. But is this really true? Is it proper to equate evolution with science? Does science have the ability to address questions regarding past events that we were not there to directly observe or verify? Events like the spontaneous origin of the universe, the origin of life from non-life, and the evolution of the earliest life forms into mammals. Or might we be giving science a power it does not have? To answer this, it is important that we accurately define science as well as its limitations. When we think of scientists in white lab coats analyzing cells under a microscope or chemists mixing acids and bases, it is known as observational science. This is the type of science that led to finding cures for diseases and our advanced technology, computers, smartphones, orbiting satellites, and Mars rover robots. A good definition of observational science can be found in standard introductory level biology textbooks, which state, "Scientific inquiry is a powerful way to know nature, but there are limitations to the kinds of questions it can answer. These limits are set by science's requirements that hypotheses be testable and falsifiable, and that observations and experimental results be repeatable." Notice observational science has definable limitations to the kinds of questions it can answer. Hypotheses must be based on observations and experimentation. In addition, hypotheses must be testable and their results repeatable. Observable, testable, and repeatable experimentation are the hallmarks of good observational science. When biologists grow bacteria on a nutrient medium to study adaptations, growth rate changes, or sequence their DNA to determine which genes suffered mutations. They are practicing good observational science. But answering the question of where bacteria came from to begin with, their origin, is outside the bounds of observational science.
Science really is about the study of the operation of the present world. And a lot of people think that, well, no, some science you study the past. Well, not really. I mean, when you dig up a fossil, people say, see, there you go, you're looking at the past. Well, no, you're looking at the present. Fossils exist in the present. And that's not to say we can't make some guesses about the past based on some of the scientific evidence we see in the present. But our worldview, our way of thinking, our view of history will obviously influence any reconstructed past. Same goes with stars and galaxies. People say, you look at a galaxy, you're looking back in time. Well, I'm looking at the galaxy today, right? The photons are hitting my eyes today. And so astronomy really takes place in the present. And granted, we can speculate about how galaxies looked, 1,000 years ago, or what stars looked like thousands of years ago. But the fact is, those kind of claims are not scientifically testable. The kind of science that makes computers work and puts people on the moon, real science, observational science, is testable and repeatable in the present. It doesn't take place in the past, it takes place now.
According to Big Bang cosmologists, the universe began 13.7 billion years ago. The Earth is said to have formed 4.5 billion years ago. The first fish evolved 530 million years ago. Dinosaurs evolved 230 million years ago. Mammals 120 million years ago. The earliest primates 50 million years ago. And Homo sapiens evolved from hominins roughly 200,000 years ago. Realize the most significant evolutionary events all allegedly occurred in the unobservable, unrepeatable, untestable, and therefore unverifiable past. Almost the entire evolutionary theory, including the Big Bang, is outside the realm of observational science. All of the aforementioned past events, and many more not mentioned, are unamenable to the scientific process. No man was there as an eyewitness to provide for us first-hand knowledge of what actually took place. Thus, evolution is more appropriately a history. Ernst Mayr is hailed by the scientific community as the Darwin of the 20th century. As a distinguished evolutionary biologist, Mayr was more than qualified to make the following admission: that evolution is a history, not an observational science. He affirmed this, saying, "Evolutionary biology, in contrast with physics and chemistry, is an historical science. The evolutionist attempts to explain events and processes that have already taken place. Laws and experiments are inappropriate techniques for the explication of such events and processes. Instead, one constructs a historical narrative, consisting of a tentative reconstruction of the particular scenario that led to the events one is trying to explain. Here Mayer did not place evolutionary biology on equal planes with physics and chemistry, which are clear examples of observational science. Instead, he describes evolution as a historical science, a very inexact type of inquiry, a tentative reconstruction, meaning it is subject to change whenever the theorizer feels it is necessary to better fit the evidence. When evolutionary scientists attempt to explain what they think happened in the past, they first presuppose that the evolutionary view of history is correct. This view of history then serves as a framework from which all evidence and data are interpreted. Mayer described this presupposed view of history as a narrative, literally a story written by scientists based on what they believe happened in the unverifiable past. The biblical view of origins, as described in the early chapters of Genesis, chapters 1 to 11, is also considered a historical narrative. The Genesis account of creation is not written in a style typical of Hebrew mythology or poetry. Instead, it is recorded as a sober historical account with precise chronological reference points, carefully detailing major origins-related events, including the recent creation of the heavens and earth, the first male and female, a global flood, and the formation of the various people groups and languages. The implications of this are profound. Rather than an issue of science versus faith, the creation-evolution controversy ultimately boils down to a face-off between two opposing histories. The major difference is that the evolutionary view of history was narrated by scientists within the last 150 years and is tentative to reconstruction, whereas the biblical view of history was recorded thousands of years ago and is not subject to continual revision.
Some might object to accepting the origins issue as a battle between two different histories and insist it actually comes down to a matter of evidence. You may think, do we really need to presuppose a certain view of history in order to accurately address the question of origins? Wouldn't it be better to just let the evidence speak for itself? While this may sound like the most objective way to approach the origins issue, it is based upon a fundamental misconception about the nature of evidence, called the evidence scale fallacy.
A lot of people have the impression that the way that you resolve the origins debate is that you try to accumulate the most evidence, as if there's a scale and, the evolutionists have some evidence and the creationists, we think we have more evidence, and so the scale weighs in our favor. The fact is we all have exactly the same evidence. I have access to the same fossils and DNA patterns as my secular colleagues. I look at the same stars and galaxies that they do. We have the same evidence. It's just a question of how do we interpret that evidence? What does the evidence mean? What conclusions do we draw from it? And that will be influenced by our worldview, our way of thinking, our belief system. Evidence by itself doesn't really mean anything. We have to interpret evidence. And so if you come to a rock, you can't just say, well, I'm just going to look at the rock and that'll objectively tell me how the rock got there and so on. No, we have a view of history, and our view of history will tell us something about the past. We can certainly use evidence in the present and try to reconstruct past events, but obviously our view of history is going to have a very profound influence on that, and you can't escape that. We all have a view of history. We all have some understanding of how the universe came to be, and that will influence necessarily our understanding of the evidence.
Take, for example, the Grand Canyon. Both creationists and evolutionists have access to the same geological features. In an attempt to explain how the canyon formed, evolutionary geologists have traditionally interpreted it as having formed over millions of years through slow and gradual processes based on the evolutionary view of history, namely the geologic timescale and uniformitarian assumptions. Geologists who accept the account of Noah's flood described in Genesis interpret the same evidence differently and describe its formation through catastrophic processes that occurred rapidly and relatively recently. This simple example describes the true nature of the origins issue. Notice both creationists and evolutionists are interpreting the same evidence and coming to opposite conclusions. This is due to the evidence being interpreted through two very different views of history. This raises an important question. If it all comes down to an interpretation of the evidence, how do we know which interpretation is correct? To answer this, we need to visit the Adirondack Mountains of New York State, where a large boulder rests alone on the 2,500-foot peak of Mount Azure. The mystery of how the boulder made its way to the top of the mountain occurred in the unobservable past. It is a historical science. No one alive today was there to verify through first-hand knowledge what actually took place. For this reason, this serves as an appropriate analogy for properly understanding the creation-evolution controversy. For the sake of simplicity, let's assume there are only two possible interpretations for how the boulder arrived at the peak of Mount Azure. The first interpretation is that Jane is abnormally strong and managed to push the 20-ton boulder to the top of the mountain all by herself. The second interpretation is that the boulder was transported by glacial ice over the top of the mountain. When the glacier melted, it left the boulder behind and is known as an erratic in geology. Now, which interpretation is correct? Without hesitation, you would immediately conclude the second interpretation is the right answer. But why was that such an easy decision to make? The answer is simple. The glacier interpretation is most consistent with the evidence from observational science, making it the far more reasonable explanation. The same level of clarity is possible when investigating the topic of creation and evolution.
Throughout this documentary, we will be examining key evidence from the major fields of science, including biology, paleoanthropology, and genetics. As we carefully examine the shared evidence, a key question to consider is which view of history, the biblical view or the evolutionary view, allows for an interpretation that is most consistent with observational science.